Thanks for coming tonight. So I'm very happy to welcome tonight our guest, Daniel Paul, who came all the way from Los Angeles to give this lecture on late modern mirror glass architecture. And it's the first time that Daniel comes to present his work in Europe, and it's the first time he comes to Europe too, actually. And I'm very pleased that I've been able to facilitate this at the AA, where I studied. And so Daniel and I actually met a year ago in Los Angeles while I was doing a residency at the Max Center. And a mutual friend introduced us and said we absolutely had to meet. And a year later, here we are, actually giving a lecture and working on a book together. And so Daniel is an architecture historian. He's been active for more than 25 years now. And he practices in 3 different ways that I'm gonna somehow introduce a little bit extensively, maybe, because I think it's quite integral to his work. And so he works as a consultant in a global company called ICF International, with like 5,000 employees worldwide, and as a freelancer, as an independent architecture historian that's recruited for specific missions, and as a volunteer as well, who actually actively and relentlessly files preservation reports in his free time. And so I'm going to start with the volunteer work because it's actually somehow the way he got into architecture history. So he studied art history in the mid-90s, and he was interested in outsider art and somehow ran into this project called Grand Map Prisbury Bottle Village in Los Angeles, which is an assemblage of construction and structures made by this woman with recycled material in the 50s and 60s. And he wanted to see it to just have a look because it was pretty close to where I grew up. And it happened to have been destroyed 2 days before by the earthquake, the 94 earthquake. And this somehow got him involved in rebuilding it and preserving it. And he became a sort of active director for the next 16 years while working in bars and restaurants in order to survive, basically. So he did that, and that's basically, I think, as I understood, led him to basically understand the importance of preservation, and was kind of instrumental in forming like a peculiar way of practicing architecture history, as I think, which I like to describe as a militant historian approach, even though he doesn't like that I say that. He calls it, he told me to say vigorous, but I don't really understand the difference. So then basically, with this experience, he got involved in the Modern Committee, which is like a volunteer group to raise awareness about post-World War II Los Angeles architecture. And in this framework, he learned the practice of preservation, where he listed, for example, the Capitol Records building, for some people who might know it, and also wrote a landmark for the Bonaventure Hotel in 2005, which was never submitted and is still unlisted. Then he also, one of the recent, let's say, volunteer listing is done are the Ambassador Grill and Lobby, which is an interior landmark. It's like a bar, basically, on the lobby inside the Kevin Roche and John Dinkalu United Nations Plaza in New York City. It's a very beautiful example of 70s and 80s lavish corporate interior with like a 4 skylight, worth seeing if you can go and see it. And recently actually he wrote the ufology context statement for California, and with which he managed to list the Integratron in Joshua Tree that you might know. And he also, for the anecdote, you can ask him later, but he managed to get the alien who designed the building to be listed as an architect, which I think is pretty cool. Then as an independent architecture historian, as a freelancer basically, he's somehow the go-to historian for LA history after the 60s. And he's been commissioned recently to write for the city of Los Angeles, the postmodernism context statement and the late modern context statement. And these documents are quite big, 40 pages, 30 pages, they're official preservation documents that are used to justify the historic quality of a listing. So these are reference documents that historians, architects, planners use in order to define on a specific style in a specific area, and through which you justify and you push a listing. So then he's also working as a guest editor on for a newsletter on architecture in 1993 with Docomomo, which is a Spanish preservation group, and he's also a teacher as well. And then maybe the most interesting, or at least I was most fascinated by, aspect of his work is he's working as a corporate consultant in his global consultancy firm called ICF International, and where he produces technical reports about cultural resources. And basically, to probably describe it in very simple, so like far too simple terms. So when you have a large infrastructural project that's being planned, he looks for like all the buildings are on the way in the area of that might be affected by the building, and every single building, and he checks whether they have any basically historical importance, and if they do, he gets deeper into it and writes the reasons why they should be saved, which in return might affect the path of the project. And so I think what is quite interesting is that he's constantly working on sorry, one second, I'm lost in my thing. So yeah, the project that includes, for example, a high-speed rail project, freeway enlargement, bridge construction project, or subway lines, and I was fascinated by the way he described his work in the corporation, because he told me something, and I want to quote him for that, which is working in a big corporate company allows him to practice architecture history in a cold and calculated way, to be deep inside the regulatory text and actually write and file the reports, because it is what actually saves building, as he says. And I think my experience, for example, of architecture history is much more in academic writing, and I was quite interested to see that a pragmatic devotion basically to the saving of buildings, and also because Daniel spends his days writing and filing reports, but he has practically considering the amount of work he produces, he has hardly published anything, which I find, which is one of the reasons I'm focusing with him on trying to turn his work into a book. And so this allows me to get to the mirror glass aspect from his corporate practice, which I think somehow echo each other. And so late modern mirror glass architecture was the subject of his master's thesis at the California State University in Northridge that he started in 2001. And they wanted him to write about Bottle Park, the first project he volunteered for, but he actually wanted to write for corporate office parks. So it was in 2001, and 5 years had passed since his art history BA, and he was fascinated by the crystalline and futuristic architecture of mirror glass buildings, because to him it seemed to be the next frontier of preservation at the time, because everything stopped at the 60s, but really there was no real interest for what happened after. And also because all these corporate buildings were actually hated by everyone. And he was wondering, why did people hate it? How did this specific corporate style come about? And also, how did it become such a prominent global phenomenon? And by coincidence, while researching it, he realized that the history of mirrored glass was particularly tied to the history of Los Angeles, and that there were a lot of examples in Orange County, so the southern area of Los Angeles, where he actually grew up. And And so the history of mirror glass is actually tied to the industrial history of Los Angeles at the time, which was a hotspot for aerospace, electronics, and high-tech industries. And it was actually at the time the world capital for high-tech industry back then, more than Silicon Valley, which was just starting off. And so, as we will see, the buildings, they are very much of the kind of high-tech aesthetic, and which is why they got. I mean, one of the reasons perhaps they got they seduced so much these corporate firms, and that my interest in this, which I think is more mine than his, is that. This what started with this high-tech industry somehow slowly, or like an aesthetic that was at first used by the high-tech industry was slowly basically employed by the like some sort of proto-neoliberal kind of business. So private banks, investment funds, insurances, pharmaceutical industry, and all sorts of headquarters for global companies started to actually build similar buildings. And Daniel calls this moment sort of like a moment when mirrored glass became like this corporate vernacular. And So yeah, I mean, the interesting thing with mirrored glass is that it featured all the characteristics that Daniel needed to focus on. It was basically an untold architecture history. It was hated, was corporate, was ubiquitous, it was anonymous. So it was mostly done by designers working in the shadows of like large corporate companies. And I think it's with his practice as a corporate architecture historian, I think that's why I wanted to underline his other work. And so, I mean, at the moment, this lecture is basically the first, let's say, step in a project we are like sketching together. We're not really sure 100% the shape it's going to have, but we're talking about making a book eventually, which is going to be, of course, centered on Daniel's scholarship on mirrored glass architecture, and but also potentially is going to include a couple of essays that are going to include this moment of architecture in its political history and also within the art history chapter. And on top of this, we want to commission a series of like a kind of a thorough photographic survey of the best examples of mirror glass architecture that you can find in the LA area. For two reasons, because first of all, they are largely undocumented, and also because most of them are being altered right now or destroyed because there's a bit shift in the corporate culture at the moment with open spaces and all sorts of startup, colorful startup open plans. And so that could help potentially to file a couple of preservation reports for a few of them. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and welcome to Daniel Paul.
Thank you for the best introduction ever. I'm very honored to be a lecturer at the Architectural Association tonight, so thank you for having me as well. I'm going to, this is about a 4-part lecture, and parts of it are front-loaded with a lot of information that's contextual to Los Angeles and toward what my research has been. Other parts are going to be slideshows where we just kind of breeze through a bunch of samples. And then toward the end, I make a case study out of Orange County. Orange County is located about 35 miles southeast of Los Angeles if you've been to Southern California. Disneyland is in Orange County, so if you're familiar with that. So I really could have began this talk on mirror glass architecture at any variety of places. Kew Gardens, the Crystal Palace, Shearbart, Corbusier, but I decided to begin here with these two buildings by Mies because they come back and they're directly influential. Many of you are probably familiar with these Friedrichstrasse on the left from 1921 and glass skyscraper proposal on the right from 1922. This idea of the glass being treated as a skin, as an all-over surface that's detached from the structural support and not having a structural support of its own, not load-bearing. And not denying the glass skin, not denying it, not just treating it simply as transparency, but acknowledging it as its own entity. We're going to see that a lot later. So I'm going to jump to the post-World War II era and the Eero Saarinen office, which plays a big role in the advent of the late modern glass skin, particularly with mirror. This is the General Motors technical facility from 1955 in Michigan, in the state of Michigan, in the upper Midwest. And obviously there was a trend in the post-war era for these smooth curtain walls. The smoother, the better. And as part of this project, Kevin Roche with John Dinkeloo, who both work under Eero Saarinen, come up with the idea for a neoprene gasket in which to hold the glazing and to support this idea of smoothness. The idea for that comes from the car windshield itself, obviously held in place by a material not unlike neoprene. And of course, this is for General Motors, so it's perfectly fitting for the client. And it just sort of points to the creative openness of the Saarinen office to do this. Here's Kevin Roche. Kevin Roche is Eero Saarinen's primary assistant. Here he is in 1964, give or take, working on a model for the Ford Foundation in New York. And Kevin actually worked on the General Motors technical facility, and it was sort of his idea to come up with this neoprene, as I mentioned. And for our purposes, Kevin is very, very important because mirrored glass is his idea. He was looking at the cover of a Life magazine in the 1950s, early 1950s, and he saw somebody on the cover of Life wearing mirrored aviator sunglasses. And he thought it would be a really good idea for a building. So Ford Foundation is not mirrored, but we'll look at some of his other buildings that are. And initially, the big glass companies in the US, Pittsburgh Plate Glass, Libby Owens Ford, and I think he may have even approached Pilkington, rejected the idea of mirrored glass skin. They thought it would be absurd. But he worked with two small companies, Liberty Mirror and Kinney Vacuum Coating in the Midwest, and came up with it. This is the very first project ever designed to have mirrored glass. It was never built. It's for Ellison Engineering, or Ellison Engine Company in Indianapolis. By then, they were a subsidiary of General Motors. This is from 1955. And you could see that on the elevation on the right, it talks in the middle, it's 1/4 inch, they called it Mural Pane. I don't know if that's the best name for a product, but it was called Mural Pane. So anyway, it was intended to have mirrored glass, but it was not made. The first project to have mirrored glass incorporated, and for which it ended up being made, was Bell Labs in Holmdel, New Jersey. And these are some shots from the Saarinen office, which at that time was still in Michigan, of mock-ups showing how the solar radiation, or how the light comes through the glass, probably dealing with some sort of shading coefficient. And Bell is eventually made. Here it is. here it is under construction. And Kevin thought that this would be a really good idea considering the fact that Bell is set within a landscape. So the idea initially was to keep heat out and to reflect the landscape. The companies that made mirrored glass initially were so small that this was designed in 57, completed in 62, but they did not have enough mirrored glass to cover the whole thing until 1967. So for a while, only the front facade had mirrored glass. At this time, Bell Laboratories, which was the research wing of AT&T, was the high technology node for the United States. Inventions out of Bell Labs not only include improving telephone technology, but would include the development of microwave transmission technology, the silicon computer chip, wireless technology, the transistor, information theory, the space satellite. All of these products and approaches were either designed at Bell Labs or refined at Bell Labs. So from the very beginning, mirrored glass is going to have an association with high technology, starting with Bell Labs. Now, Kevin had a design manager working on this project under him. This, by the way, was one of the projects completed after Eero Saarinen passed away. Eero Saarinen died pretty young in 1961. And after he died, Kevin took over the firm and it became known as Rohding Kalu. So completed a variety of Eero Saarinen projects. The glass on this allowed 25% of light to pass through and 70% of the sun's heat was blocked. His assistant on this, his design manager, was an architect named Anthony Lumsden. Tony Lumsden was born in England, but raised and educated in Australia, went to the University of Sydney. And on this building, and unfortunately this picture doesn't really show it, you still have vertical mullions protruding, like you had on many post-war buildings of that era. Tony wanted to reverse the mullions to imply a skin on the building. He figured, well, you can't really see inside it anymore. And the mirrored glass gives you a quality of form. It's reflecting everything around it, but it's also conveying a sense of form. So the combination of already you have an all-over surface, why not take it to the next level and make it a skin? But Kevin declined the idea at the time. He thought that if you did not have vertical mullions on this, you would have no shadow play, and you would probably, just have this all-over box, which you would have. He was right. So this is Tony Lumsden on the right, and on the left is Cesar Pelli. In 1964, they were hired by a large Los Angeles firm called Daniel Mann Johnson Mendenhall, or DIMGen, as they are known. DIMGen was founded in 1946, and this was we have a lot of these firms in Los Angeles, and we did during the post-war era. They were instrumental in building a city that was growing very, very fast. You needed these sort of infrastructure firms. They weren't boutique design firms in any sense. From 1940 to 1960, Los Angeles grew from 2.8 to 6 million people, Los Angeles County. So in 20 years, there was a population increase in Los Angeles County of 3.2 million people. So the city was growing very fast. DIMGen was one of these firms that answered to that growth. But they were aware that they wanted to do a little bit better in the design department than they were. Some of the early buildings are pretty good, but they wanted to hire, they were concerned with this idea of copying the sort of orthodox modernism of, copying Mies or whatnot. So they went to the Saarinen firm. They hired Cesar Pelli as their design director, and Cesar brought on Tony as his assistant. So Dim Jim is doing high-tech work in Los Angeles. They did work for Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas and all of these aerospace firms. The year that Cesar and Tony were hired, 1964, there were 1,321 high-tech establishments in Los Angeles, employing 316,000 people. So high-tech is a very, very important part of the milieu, or the situation of LA in the 1960s. It is creating, it becomes part of the culture. It's the global capital of aerospace and high tech in the 1960s, so it's only natural that a regional version of high tech would come out of it. Well, their very first project out of the gate was this, and unfortunately it was never made, and it actually came this close to being made. This is Sunset Mountain Park, designed in 1964 and completed in 1966. It won the PA First Place Jury Award in 1966 and was on a Progressive Architecture cover. This was going to be this was a high-density housing project. So those are all condominiums, 1,500 dwelling units with a chapel up in the middle, shops, offices. So, of course, it's a mega structure of sorts on 2,100 acres. Tony had worked on a project under Kevin Roche called Oakland Museum, and it had this stepped or terraced quality, if any of you have ever been to Oakland Museum, of integrating into the earth. And that same idea gets used here. Instead of building like a tower on this mountain, this is in the Santa Monica Mountains, there's this attempt to acknowledge the terrain of the natural landscape. So there's this interesting response for how many units that is, it's a fairly small footprint to nature, but still obviously an overtly high-tech, futuristic aesthetic that they are dealing with. This is Teledyne Labs. This was an early project that was completed using what was then a new technology in this mirrored glass. So by 1963, the bigger glass firms are building this they're designing, they're fabricating mirrored glass. And in the US, that's going to be Pittsburgh Plate Glass and Libby Owens Ford. They basically use metal oxide to reflect solar radiation and tin oxide to enhance thermal radiation. And this is not an all-over glass skin, but you have it on the front of this building. And there's this sense of reflectivity, of form giving, of treating the facade as a shiny surface. And some of these, of breaking apart the box, some of these ideas seem to definitely come from James Sterling and James Gowan at Leicester. They were very, very inspired by James Sterling. Both of them admitted that. So with Leicester sort of, wrapping everything, treating it as a skin, not to mention the workshop wing, which approximates a smooth glass skin of sorts, there are definitely some corollaries. So anyway, this is Teledyne. It uses Pittsburgh plate glass on here, and Rainer Banham called this an example of the case study style that almost wasn't. And you could see there's these smooth reversed mullions there. And these protrusions are called fingers coming out of here. And Teledyne was a high-tech firm. Now, this is going to be designed in 1966. This is the Federal Aviation Administration. This is the first building to have an all-over mirrored glass skin. So on this, Tony finally got to do what he wanted on Bell Labs, to reverse that mullion and treat it in an all-over capacity. Los Angeles at this time did not have any architectural critics. Los Angeles did not have its first full-time architectural critic until 1969, so there was a lot of room to experiment. It was a really open city, both to new ideas and literally. I mean, it was just very horizontal, very undeveloped. So where the FAA, this is the headquarters for the Federal Aviation Administration, their West Coast headquarters, where this is made, it was wide open at the time and could reflect its surroundings. And of course, aerospace, the Federal Aviation Administration, it ties right into the, the high-tech concepts that are already floating around in LA. So this wraparound skin, the idea here was to try to wrap it around, to deny the building as four sides and to wrap it around corners as much as possible. And it's akin to an encasing on a 747 jet or an early piece of computer equipment. It has some references to 1930s kind of streamline modernism. So there's a certain nostalgia about it, but nonetheless, this is the first building designed with a mirrored glass skin. It's not the first building completed. It's not completed until 1973, but it's the first building designed. Tony and Cesar refer to this design system as non-gravitational, non-directional. You know, it's an all, the horizontal, the transoms and the mullions they only stick out about 3/8 of an inch. There's no implied verticality or, monumentality. In fact, it's horizontal. And it's interesting that it seems like a very atmospheric building, which is perfect for Los Angeles, this dematerialized, lightweight, atmospheric design. And those were some of the stated intentions of this non-gravitational, non-directional aesthetic. So to go back to the Mies building on the right, this designer on the left is Philo Jacobson. He worked at Dim Jim under Cesar and Tony. And I only show it again because I found this slide in Tony Lumsden's archives, and there was the building. So obviously it was meant to be an influence on what came, and early examples of this design system. Most of you are probably familiar with these, the SOM Lever House on the left from 1952 and Seagram's from 1958. I just had these up here to show kind of what they were tasked with designing against, because so many people were copying this at the time. So Lever House has a plinth. There's a subtly implied base shaft capital still. And of course, this gets close to a skin, but you still have transparent vision levels, and the vertical mullions are slightly predominant. The Mies building actually has a T-bar added. So this is actually from my thesis, which I wrote a long time ago, which is why it's all typed with a typewriter. But it was a long time ago. And there's the Pelli Lumsden mullion on the left and the Miesian mullion on the right. So it's basically reversed. With Pelli and Lumsden, that's still single glazing. They're going to do design work with double glazing later. And they do this building together. This is completed in 1969. This is the first building to have an all-over glass skin. The FAA is the first one designed. This is the first one completed. So it's kind of a dark black gray skin. It's not flat out mirror, but it's the reflectivity that they were after. This is Century City Medical Plaza from, 1969. This whole building was done for $28 a square foot back then, which wasn't too bad. When you work at a company like Dim Jim, the idea was to keep costs down. So I really admire their constraints, the fact that they had to work with such tight constraints and to do something interesting for a big company that didn't give you that many hours to design anything at all. because it's just time and budget. And yet they come up with something subtle but different and really, really conceived and really thought out. So with Century City Medical Plaza, they're kind of using some aspects of the Misesian language against the folks who are copying Mies poorly. So you have the curtain wall, you have the certain aspects of it are emphasized. That idea of a curtain wall is emphasized or exaggerated. I know that Charles Jenks has talked a lot about that as a character-defining feature of late modernism, that idea of exaggerating aspects of modernism as a way to react against them. But in this case also, the building has a very sculptural quality. This, by the way, is the building that Cesar Pelli credits with being the influence on Century City Medical Plaza, and it's lesser known of the earlier works. This is Bohumir Cermak. This is the Glass Tower complex from 1928. It's at an exhibition of contemporary culture in Brno, Czech Republic. And you could see the membrane here is handled in a very taut, tight manner. And the mullions on Century City Medical Plaza are, similar in dimension, in their rectangularity. So here's another shot of Century City Medical Plaza. They take away the base, shaft, and capital, and they just give you an all-over, like I said, non-directional, non-gravitational glass skin. Very atmospheric, very future forward, and very much inspired by minimalist art of the time. Here's a work by Tony Smith from 1967 called Maze. This work actually weighs 9,000 pounds. It's heavy. And, if you're familiar with some aspects of 1960s minimalist sculpture, there's these ideas of three-dimensional work to treat, to deal with the objecthood of something, the three-dimensional object, and to democratize the work, to take the sculpture off of its base, and like you see here. And a sense of dematerialization is often part of that as well with those 60s works. Well, you see all of those aspects with Century City Medical Plaza. It's taken off its base. There's no plinth to speak of. There's a dematerialized quality about it that's simultaneously form-giving. And so there's a definite influence there, comparing the two works, and it's treated as a three-dimensional object. It's about objecthood. It's not a building in the typical sense. Cesar Pelli is approaching it as a three-dimensional object, the way that much minimalist sculpture of the time was written of. Cesar Pelli leaves Dim Jim for Gruen, Victor Gruen firm who has a very, very sizable Los Angeles office in 1968. And right out of the gate, he does this work here. This is a proposal for United Nations City from 1969 built on a park between old and new channels in the Danube River in Vienna. And today there's a work there called the Vienna International Center. Cesar Pelli is very interested in the idea of circulation spines. These pragmatic parts of getting people through a building in a reasonably efficient fashion. So this deals with horizontal and vertical circulation spines, which he's very interested in. This was going to be 4 million square feet, 1,500 feet long. It was a competition entry, and he actually won the competition. And then for some mysterious reason, it was sort of put out again, and he lost, and they just gave it to somebody else. So there's probably some intrigue behind why that happened. But you could see the 7 towers there. are mirrored glass. Again, to reference Sterling's Leicester project, looks a lot like the tower at Leicester with the chamfers. And this is supposed to be an open hand, which is, of course, a symbol of peace. So if you look at the tips of it, the thumb, the pointer, the middle finger, the ring finger, the pinky, whatever, that was the sort of subtle symbolism of this. So again, just another, a mega structure being done, very early on. Mirrored glass gets used for global, something that's kind of multinational, like the UN, if not globalist. So I'm going to focus a little bit on Cesar. Cesar Pelli's interests are very, very much informed by the Los Angeles art scene. This is a image called LACMA Family Portrait, shot at LACMA in February of 1968. And you have all of these various, Southern California artists here. They said I have a pointer. Let's see. So you have, Larry Bell, Billy L. Bankston, let's see, Ed Ruscha, I think, is back there. That's got to be Ruscha. I think that's one of his works. So all of these artists and some others, the writer Esther McCoy, the architectural writer, Julius Schulman, the architectural photographer, but you have a couple of architects in this as well. There's Frank Gehry right there, the top, and over here is Cesar Pelli. Holding a picture of his ComSat Labs project. So Cesar's working for these, a big corporate firm like Gruen, but he's very, very tied in with this art scene. And, for Southern California architecture, most people just associate they just assume that would be Frank Gehry alone, but Cesar was too. And his work is going to be really informed by it. This is San Bernardino City Hall in the community, the city of San Bernardino, about 60 miles east of LA. They wanted something very future forward for their city to make a statement. This is designed in 1969, completed in 72. And there's definitely a high-tech or machine aesthetic going on here with the encasement. He's using the all-over glass skin in two ways. It's very form-giving. And then at the bottom level, at least, it's intended to be an homage to Larry Bell. So there's a Larry Bell cube on the left. He's a light and space artist based in Southern California. And Cesar Pelli is very interested in this same idea of perceptual transparency, this idea of being able to see multiple levels of multiple layers in a medium. And that's what Bell was after too, to see through the cube, to see a reflection in the cube, to see different, facets or glazing levels of the cube. And at San Bernardino City Hall on the ground level, you see inside the building, you see the glass, you see the reflectivity on the outside. And it was very important for Cesar to get that balance right. And you could see your own reflection in it. As well. I tried to stay out of this picture, so it's about this idea. Cesar is trying to take the skin and do something really to give the skin its own presence. Not denying it, not just using it as form giving to something else or as something to see through for transparency's sake, but to let it really do something interesting. There's another shot of San Bernardino City Hall, just this high-tech aesthetic here. Columbus Commons Mall by Cesar Pelli. This is a work by Peter Alexander on the left. He's a light and space artist out of Southern California and who does work in resin. And you can kind of see a little bit of the same concept with this all black glass mall in terms of its cut, its shape. And this was built not in Southern California, but in Columbus, Indiana from 1973. And this work here, this is actually Cesar's image, and I think that's him taking the picture. There's a Craig Coffman a Peter Alexander work on the left called Cloudbox from 1966 in cast resin. And sure enough, there's a shot on Columbus Commons on the facade of this idea of multiple layers again, with clouds, with Cesar Pelli, with a reflection of the building. So he's trying to do interesting aspects with this skin. I just have this in here for the heck of it. Cesar was so into art that he actually got really into pop art and did this work that's kind of an homage to James Rosenquist, I think. But this was a very, very, very short-lived restaurant in St. Louis, Missouri called the Beef Encounter. So, and you can see on the sign across the top, the lips are mouthing, "I love it." Works here by Craig Coffman. So Craig Coffman is a Finnish fetish artist, and they're really big in Southern California in the 1960s also. This idea of the glossy, the slick, sensual surface, hot rod culture, surfboard culture, which are all, surfboards are very shiny and, they're these composite materials from the aerospace industry, from the high-tech industry. So there's just a couple of works in Finnish fetish, and then there's the Pacific Design Center. So again, just that reference to 1960s art of the time. The Pacific Design Center Blue Building is designed in 1971 and completed in 1975. It's based off Cesar's favorite building, the Crystal Palace, his favorite modern era building. And it serves the same basic purpose, and it kind of is a subtle call out to it with the vault, with the blue. This is a rather large building. It was very controversial at the time. He got a lot of heat for this from people like Pauline Schindler and others, for how out of scale it was with its immediate vicinity in the Los Angeles community of West Hollywood. Everything around this is very diminutive. And then you have this. But Cesar was right. He said, there's going to be other big buildings here eventually. There's a hospital nearby called Cedars-Sinai. There's other towers being made. And Mario Gandelsonis had a really interesting point about this. He called it a new tool for mapping the global city. So it's not in scale with its immediate neighborhood, but it really is kind of in scale with Los Angeles as an expanded horizontal metropolis. Now, I think a very interesting comparison can be made to the Pompidou, which I have in the lower right. There are two different versions of high tech, of course. The Pompidou is. They were designed at the same time. The design of both started in 1971. The Pompidou's completed in 77. The PDC, Blue Building, is completed in 75. They are almost the identical measurements. The Pompidou is 166 by 60 meters and 7 levels high, and the Pacific Design Center Blue Building is 162 by 67 meters and 6 levels high. And they're both, a little bit out of scale with their immediate surroundings. So there's a definite, I see them as sister buildings. I really do. They're two different versions of high tech. And Cesar Pelli is very much influenced by light and space. This is a James Turrell work called Rondo Blue from 1969. I am almost certain he must have seen this. He has mentioned that the facade, that bank, was intended to be like atmospheric, like light and space, and the color of that is just so spot on with Rondo Blue. And Cesar's Southern California buildings all tend to be very, very atmospheric. They're very atmospheric buildings. They have an atmosphere about them. They try to create atmosphere. And that was one of the intentions of these early late modern glass skin designs, was not only to be high tech, but to create a sense of atmosphere. Which makes sense then that, the Los Angeles context begins to make sense in that regard. Cesar Pelli and Tony, who we'll talk about in a minute, are both really interested in the idea of extrusion, of sectional extrusion, of taking one part and repeating it and finding an economy with that, of not giving it a cap, or something at each horizontal end. And I just sort of have this slide in here to show that sense of extrusion, that sense of future forward high tech with this, grandma, walking into this vortex over there. And very, very futuristic imagery. And of course, very super studio-esque. The connections here are hard to ignore with continuous monument, or their idea, the way that they used gridism. Continuous monument Super Studios starts in 1966, and Continuous Monument is put out, I believe, in '69. So it's right around the same time that these buildings are being designed. And Tony is also very interested in ArchiZoom. We found ArchiZoom files in his archives, and then archigram itself. Tony really loved archigram, and what he liked about this was the idea of total enclosure. He was really interested in the idea of enclosure. His son told me that he liked the fact that this did not have obvious windows and doors in the typical sense. And so he wanted to get away from that in his own work. And of course, this high tech. Now, something else that Tony's very interested in is the biological. Whereas Cesar's really interested in the art components, Tony gets really interested in the biological membrane aspects of the skin. So now I'm going to shift to Tony. After Cesar leaves for Gruen, Tony's now the design director at DimGym. He would stay there pretty much the rest of his career until he turned 65, and they basically fired him. And he started his own practice. So he was very unknown. So he becomes the vice president and design director at DimGym. And all these projects that they do right out of the gate, I swear, Sunset Mountain Park for both of them, and then UN City. And then Tony does this. This was going to be a scheme. If you're familiar with Santa Monica, there's a pier with a carnival and, Ferris wheel and all that. It was Pacific Ocean Park. Well, they were going to level that and build this. And the community was pretty upset about it, actually, because remember, Sunset Mountain Park was going to be in the Santa Monica Mountains, too. So anyway, this was drafted, a developer named John Morhart, or Jack Morhart. I really don't know how serious this was. It's just so amazing. You have a 30-story, 600-room hotel that's 300 feet offshore. And it was just going to be this cylindrical shaft with this semi-transparent glass, and I guess you would just walk out there. I don't even know how you get out there. There's the rest of the buildings. There's some really gigantic birds in the lower right. This is actually a wonderful rendering by a man named Carlos Diniz, who did incredible renderings for a lot of the big firms in Southern California. Speaking of birds, this is actually an image that Tony used to show quite often. This is from his slide deck. And he was really into this idea of mutation in nature, that you could have mutations or changes. And he was into this idea that there's not one, form doesn't just, there's not one right form for function. You could have variety in nature. Nature affords you variety. So all of these birds have the same structural system, but obviously they have variety. They have different colors, they have different shapes. And he kind of takes that biological aspect to note when he designs his buildings. which we'll look at. These are just some scribble notes that he had about membrane. He was always writing about membrane. He gave membrane glass skins more thought than any other architect I know of. He was constantly contemplating membrane, talking about how it could be an enclosure, connecting it to biology, and really sticks with the glass membrane more so than just about anybody else. He's really into the idea of extrusion too. So he does a series of buildings on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles that are vertical extrusions. And he uses the non-directional, non-gravitational glass skin to really break apart the box, to start breaking apart the box. And this is a very, cost economical system. Because you cannot see inside it, you could kind of shift the floors in the view wherever you need it to be in there. You have some give. There doesn't have to be anything sort of preconceived based on the exterior aesthetic. Because the spandrel and the vision glass is exactly the same, you can make it more economical inside than otherwise you might be able to, actually. So this was another way of kind of cutting costs and giving the developers more bang for their buck. But it's also a very interesting design made with Libio and Sford solar bronze reflecting glass. A lot of people who write about late modernism talk about the paradox of a glass building with no windows. But Tony says, the windows are part of he wanted to treat the windows as part of a surface rather than just holes in the surface. So, and you place them where they're required rather than where an aesthetic system dictates. So there's a certain pragmatism running through him, yet doing something interesting not just in spite of, but because of that pragmatism. Because of it, and regardless, he's doing something really interesting with very, very little. And in terms of budget, this was designed in 1969 and completed in 1971. This was the next of his kind of mutated vertical extrusion. So it kind of breaks apart the box a little bit more. This is Century Bank Plaza, completed in 1972. And this is the west elevation on the right here, where this is popping out. And he popped this out, he extended this to give people views of the Santa Monica Mountains. He wanted to somehow find ways to, afford people more connections with views, basically. And he broke apart the box to do so and uses the all-over glass skin as a means to do so. Esther McCoy wrote about these buildings as having an inner energy dynamic, as if there's something inside them that kind of just wants to come out. This is Roxbury Plaza, the third of these, so it's even more mutated. It's a box that's even more disassembled. But these mutations are not arbitrary. This is a trapezoidal shaped lot. And so he's doing this to make the building more cost efficient, to get more out of it. So that's the pressure, the onus is on him to do this working at a place like Dimgen. So he talks a lot about economic forces. He has said that it's in the control of economic forces, and he had very few choices. He could deal a little bit with the shape, the flatness or depth of the mullion, and the decision whether to use opaque or translucent glass and at what level. And that's basically it. Everything else to Tony is economic forces. So in those constraints, it's interesting that at these big firms, which you would associate with globalism, the architects within these big firms have these tight constraints and are trying to do something incredibly interesting within very, very tight constraints. And it's something I really sort of got out of researching this. Then we come to his horizontal extrusions, which are rather remarkable and were never made. So he takes a section, a really unique section, and extrudes it. This was going to be for Lugano Convention Center. This was a 5-acre site overlooking a lake in Lugano, Switzerland. And it was going to be a hotel and convention center designed around certain views. He did a pitch black model of this too, which is rather remarkable. A 360-room hotel. This is 1972. 32,800 square feet of exhibition space. It's kind of the last building placed sideways and extruded. So you could sort of see the evolution. So the section is the generator of form, and he's going to do it in mirrored glass. And then you have finally Beverly Hills Hotel. This was never made, and it's as if whatever was bustling around inside the form has now purged itself out, and you're back to having a box again, but now it's horizontal, and something is rolling out of it. So this is Beverly Hills Hotel. The cylinders are kind of breaking free, but each of those cylinders had a different use or a different purpose for a porte cochere or shops or whatever the case is. And this is actually rather wonderful too. This is an alternate version of Beverly Hills Hotel from 1973. And it's based off an Underwood 450 typewriter. So if I saw this, without really knowing, I would definitely think that this was, from the 80s. It looks so new wave, but it's 1973. And just to show you a couple of other buildings, Tony's really good at doing the 80s, envisioning the 80s and the 70s. The upper left is Tillman headquarters from 1974, completed in 83, I think. And on the lower right, you have Roybal Health Center in East Los Angeles with these sort of these computer graphic type grids, these versions of the future. Interesting, before CAD really takes hold, that's when you have futurism. It seems like after CAD gets going, you don't have futurism like this anymore, which is an interesting thought. The building in the upper left, by the way, is used as Starfleet Academy on Star Trek: The Next Generation. And just a couple more. Once the 80s come, Tony's doing really unreal work here. This was a proposal for Bowers Museum in Santa Ana from 1981. And then this is the Hyperion Waste Treatment Facility. This is for treating sewage, but he works for a big firm like Dim Jim, and they're concerned with, infrastructure. It's an infrastructural building, yet even a sewage treatment plant, he tries to do something really interesting with it, with the sectional extrusion and this wonderful color palette. And that takes us to this building by Lumsden. This is Bhumidaya Bank, designed he worked on this design from 1972 to 1976. And I have this building on here as an example of kind of where this goes. This was intended to be built in Jakarta, Indonesia, 35 stories, 1 million square feet. And this really sort of points to the idea that this becomes the sort of aesthetic of globalism, the aesthetic of corporations, of transnodalism, of late capitalism. Now that you're doing late capitalism and you're transnodal, to not do a box, to do something that's shaped, that's distinctive, and uses this all over, mirrored skin to do this. And around the time that this model was put out there was a conference at UCLA in LA called there were two. There was 4 days in May and then 4 days in April. And at that time, the LA architects are starting to coalesce into a group called the Silvers. They're trying to give themselves a sense of cohesive identity. And what's really interesting is that the common thread in their work tends to have a certain element of anonymity to it. In fact, James Sterling was a guest at that. He was sort of their special guest at the 1976 conference, and he said, well, it's kind of like chic fashion packaging, and there's some streamlined styling, and it's an attitude based on the building type. It's very pragmatic and very economical. David Gebhard, a Southern California architectural historian who was also at that conference, said, well, again, good taste as fashion, architecture as fantasy, 1930s packaging, and that it could be built anywhere. And and I respectfully disagree with him on this point. He thought that this could have been developed anywhere too. But I really feel that this has a very, very intrinsic Los Angeles context. Even the anonymity of it, the fact that it was a large firm, that Tony himself was anonymous, and Cesar was, working for a big firm too back then. It makes sense that a globalist aesthetic would come out of a place like 1960s Los Angeles, where there was no there, as people used to say all the time. So now that I've talked about Cesar and Tony, I'm just going to run through really quickly. This is the part where we breeze through some other samples. This is by Pay Fried. And the next few examples I'm going to show are kind of the works that in architectural history books get credit as being either the first or the most significant. This is the John Hancock Insurance Company by Pay Fried, designed by Henry Cobb. And this is a very early design, 1967. Anything from 67 or 68 is really early. Cesar and Tony do FAA and Century City Medical Plaza 1 year before, and then it seems everybody jumps on the bandwagon 1 year later. Tallest building in New England. It's next to a Henry Hobson Richardson church in the Richardsonian Romanesque style. The narrow part is, so it's, this faceted parallelogram, this cold crystalline aesthetic. And they, I think Pay Fried had a bigger budget than Cesar and Tony did on most of their Los Angeles works. IDS Center by Johnson Berge, designed in 68, completed in 1972, 57 stories. The tallest building in Minnesota, with multiple corner offices and a glacé à répétition, I guess it's called, and 32 corner offices over here, and sort of a birdcage effect on the mullions. So this often gets called, one of the first. But these are the big examples. The iconic examples: Pennzoil Place by Johnson Berge, finished in 1975. The client did not want another quote-unquote upturned cigar box. So when John Berge and Philip were on the plane back, John took out a napkin, took the box and lobbed it off and put the second element next to it, and that's a 10-foot space between them. And then Pennzoil, an oil company, can go into one building and then just lease the other one out to somebody else. Because a lot of oil companies didn't want to share one building, they wanted their own. I just kind of have this over here on the right. This is from a Gregory Baddock book on minimalist art, one of his iconic books. That's Brian O'Doherty's Pear from 1967. I sometimes get curious if some of these architects actually saw some of these works, because it seems like there's a strong resemblance, at least between those two. Kevin Roche. So this is UN Plaza by Kevin Roche from 1975. Again, there's not too many of these in New York City, but this is one of them. The shaped, faceted, sculptural treatment, in this case with a smaller mullion module to make the building seem bigger. It's about 4 feet, 10 inches per square across. And there's two of these buildings. There's one behind it that you could barely see. The United Nations headquarters is right across the street. It has glass of the same color. And Kevin actually worked on UN on that. So it's kind of, it's intended to relate to the UN in its coloring and the smoothness of its curtain wall. And it reads as a solid surface, from a distance, as a lot of these do. Here's this rather wild alternate version for UN Plaza that Kevin was going to do. And he said his logic was, well, most flags of the world have red or blue in them. And he was working on developing red reflecting mirrored glass for this, which would have been just amazing. I would have loved to have seen that. So, and here's the interior of it. So the mirrored treatment continues on the inside, not the interior of this one, well, it's his unmade model, but of this. So the mirrored treatment continues on the inside, this faceted, this octagonal infinity shelf for a vase, these octagonal columns, and just kaleidoscopic interior, very much of the late modernism. And this by Kevin. This is actually earlier than UN. This is designed in 1967. So again, anything from 67. So Kevin is a master in this. This is College Life Insurance Company in Indianapolis, designed in 1967 and opened in January of 1972. The idea was this insurance company needed to expand, so Kevin designed 9 of these pyramids in case they needed 9. They didn't, so they did need 3. And these are colossal. It's really hard to get a sense of the scale of these by looking at the picture. They are giant, and but they're icons for Indianapolis. These are today called the College Life Pyramids. They're rented out as premium office spaces. I think that's an artificial lake in front of them. But just this idea of the shaped, the sculptural, using mirrored glass, masterfully, which again Kevin originally developed. He's the developer of it. These wonderful interiors inside the building. And it's really interesting that as these buildings become more hermetic on the outside, the insides tend to become more open plan. And this is referred to as an office landscape, an open plan office landscape in the articles about this. But it's interesting that, in the 70s, you have the beginning of the open plan, simultaneously with the exterior, the more hermetic skin. And you could see the mullions sort of protruding in right there as well. Other Saarinen folks, so Kevin, Tony, and Cesar are all from Saarinen's office. This is Gunnar Burkert's. He designs this in 1967. This is the Minneapolis Federal Building. This is a suspension structure with mirrored glass. So it's suspended, sort of hooked on the top, and bracketed on the sides. And I knew somebody who worked in this, and they said when it got really windy, it would kind of swing, which was a problem. But that's supposed to be a big M for Minneapolis, which is where it's located. This building here, so there's not too many of these in the Midwest, but early on there are. This is one of the very first buildings designed and completed. HOK, Helmuth Abada Kassebaum, Equitable, Life Insurance. A lot of these buildings are for insurance companies. And so this was in Transformations in Modern Architecture by Arthur Drexler, a MoMA show from 1980. And Drexler pointed out the fact that, the simpler the form, the more effective these designs often are. Canada gets involved in the game early. Ronan Iredale's suspension building, West Coast Transmission Company from 1969. And this is a very early all mirrored glass pavilion. This is the earliest mirrored glass sort of structure, but it's not really a building. It's a temporary pavilion by Arthur Erickson for the Expo 70 Osaka, Japan pavilion. And this is supposed to reference the Canadian landscape. It's supposed to be simultaneously an ice glacier to reference a mountain and the sky itself. So it's doing all kinds of things. This design system takes off in the south of the US. So where it's warmer, where you're at a 34th latitude, right? This is Blue Cross Blue Shield by Odell and Associates from 1973, and I think it's in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And it's just large trapezoid, and you have those wild late modern, again, just walking, this gentleman with his suitcase walking into the corporate vortex here. Another shot of it. They had to do that. This building's 500 feet long, and they had to do wind tunnel tests on it for tornadoes. Everybody was really nervous about the shape. Another work by Blue Cross Blue Shield in Maryland. So I don't know why Blue Cross Blue Shield is a health insurance company in the States. I don't know why they got so into this, but they did some great buildings. So this is by Peterson and Brickbauer from 1972. And then you have these sort of random office parks. So a lot of the buildings I've just talked about, these early ones were for insurance companies, health insurance. I still don't know why this became such a big deal with the insurance company initially. But you also have these random office parks, screens like this, Century Center Atlanta from 1974 by 3D International. Century Center San Antonio, 1972, also by 3D International. Their primary designer was Harwood Taylor, and he drew this out on a napkin during lunch. So it's 2 buildings on napkins. Somebody's got to do a book just on buildings designed on napkins. I think it'd be fantastic. Peachtree Plaza by John Portman, and John Portman will come up later. This was the tallest hotel building constructed when it was completed in 1977. It's 73 stories, 5,000 windows, all in PPG LHR solar bronze. So this was made, this was constructed. Futuristic imagery. Hyatt Regency in Dallas, Texas, 1978 by Lou Nadorf for Welton Beckett Associates. Lou also did Capitol Records in Hollywood. And this was intended to be a Xanadu, like this little mini wonderland. It was designed for convention goers, and Lou knew that convention goers go to conventions to escape, to be in another world. So you have a rotating cocktail lounge up there and this grouping of towers. Campbell Center by Newhouse and Taylor in Dallas, made with real gold on the glass. The designers wanted me to know that when I interviewed them. There used to be a soap opera, a 70s a Friday night soap opera on CBS called Dallas. And in the opening shots of Dallas, a helicopter flies over and they just show all these mirrored glass buildings, Hyatt Regency, and this over here. So it's very photogenic. Paul Rudolph's City Center 1 and City Center 2 completed in 1984 in Fort Worth. Paul Rudolph, the man who had this done was a man named Perry Bass. Sid Bass. And he went to Yale, and took classes in Paul Rudolph's art and architecture building, and decided he wanted to hire him to do something once he got done with school. Rudolph saw these structures as Autobots, kind of like humanoid. He didn't try to disguise their bigness, and he treated them as sort of like with humanoid qualities, having, he called the little bump outs at the top puppy dog ears. So some details, these sort of gridism, these amazing sort of escalators, some of the best escalators in the United States with this high-tech imagery. Then we get to LA. So this is where I'm gonna bring it home. This was the first all mirror glass building completed. This is the CNA building by Langdon and Wilson. And Langdon and Wilson is a prototypical big LA firm, but they're interested in making their buildings disappear and integrating them with the landscape. The designer on this was a man named Hans Mumper, and he said that the facade, quote unquote, simply wanted to be that way. So it was just very straightforward. It's a design that's easy to comprehend, to like or dislike. Now, there was a silent partner with Langdon Wilson named Emmett Wemple. He was a landscape designer, and all of Langdon and Wilson's early buildings tend to be mirrored, and they're not all mirrored, but the mirrored ones do tend to be in these landscapes. So there's this very sort of prismatic, intense quality about this that sort of, points to a sort of heightened intensity of effect. It's almost hallucinogenic, but yet skin deep at the same time. There it is in an ad. It was marketed extensively. Sears West Coast headquarters, David Martin and Ron Pagliasotti for AC Martin. John Pastier, this is done in 71. The architecture critic for the LA Times said of this building, "The building looks like a glistening object that arrived from a friendly and prosperous planet, or a giant ceremonial artifact left by a technologically advanced civilization." And there's Super Studio, so it seems very similar. More screens in Southern California, Kojima Associates for Nissan US headquarters from 1972. These work very well in Southern California because of the atmosphere. Arco, later work by Philo Jacobson in Long Beach. And then in Orange County. So Cole Center is developed by a man named Don Cole, who after seeing the Langdon and Wilson CNA building, hires them to do 122 acres of mirrored glass buildings. And all of these are very small. Don Cole is also responsible for developing a lot of the tilt-up industrial buildings that Louis Baltz shot, if you're familiar with him. And all of these are sort of meant for small businesses, and they're set in the landscape. So you have silver buildings. This is in front of a fake lake called Lake Elliott that's only 18 inches deep and was cleaned 4 times a year. They were very proud of that at the time. It was cleared and cleaned 4 times a year. This is Cole Center Block D, this sort of hallucinogenic infinite reflectivity, 1978. This cube from 1980, zebra stripes, and my favorite, gold. So very unusual. In Orange County, these are, Orange County is what we call a post-industrial landscape to be sure. And you have these developments that tend to be like mini metropolises that just kind of pop up all together. And by 1991, when a lot of these were made, Orange County was the 3rd largest downtown, quote unquote, in California, next to LA and San Francisco, in terms of office space. There's 3 cities in South Orange County: Costa Mesa, Newport, and Irvine. And combined, they had 21 million square feet of office space. These buildings are, these are like mini metropolises that just kind of pop up all at once with these mirrored glass buildings, and very much associated with the service society vernacular. Not industry, but consultants, lawyers, people who make their money is professionals in the service industry. In buildings such as this, just rather, not a masterpiece, but very basic, but using a PPG Solex 550 reflecting glass for these rather, hallucinogenic effects with the atmosphere. Typical, a shot of this. Everybody in Orange County seems to drive a Lexus, or, so you have all these, what are they, Lexi? Is that the plural of Lexus? And next to it, you tend to have, if you don't want to do the soft landscape, you do the hardscape. This is by Isamu Noguchi. This is within the complex I'm showing you called Segerstrom Center, or South Coast Plaza Town Center, from 1979 to 1982. All done on preconception, pre-planned. The owner of this land talked to the California Department of Transportation to put a new freeway through his farm, his lima bean fields, and so from that he developed this in a giant mall called South Coast Plaza. Just another shot of Noguchi Gardens. This is called a California scenario. Irvine Towers in Irvine by A.C. Martin. Again, this idea of the pop-up, kind of like a fake downtown, where even in the building on the right, it implies multiple buildings. With these very interesting hardscape features, this is a sculpture from 1982 or 1986 by Jerome Kirk called Avion. Very much of the era now. And in Orange County, Los Angeles was largely built out by 1965, so Orange County was not. It was developing a lot in the 1970s. By the 1980s, it was the richest county per capita in the United States. So there was a lot of development, and there's a lot of tech industry down there too. So they're really interested in this slick tech aesthetic. This was for Xerox, the copy company, and that's supposed to be a piece of paper coming out of a copy machine, programmatic corporate. This one by a designer for Langdon and Wilson named Arthur V. Strock. He's one of their really a wonderful designer who goes out on his own and starts doing these buildings. This won't be in any architectural history books. This is Newport Irvine Center from 1981, but it's very intact and it's very telling of the era, and the white mullions are rather catching, very jazzy. In buildings like this, just these anonymous little buildings with shaped, faceted chamfers, faceted minimalist sculpture treatment, and of course you're dealing with high tech if you get a bump of red like that. And then you get these bigger scale examples in Orange County. Fluor, this is 1.3 million square feet of office space for an engineering company by Welton Beckett. The designer is Karl Schwertfeger, designed from 1973 to 1977. And this lower building is for the workers, and it's all open plan, 1.3 million square feet of open plan. And this is for the executives right behind it. They wanted to be separate from each other, which is fine. And Mr. Fluor said, if you make it to the top, executives there, you've really made it. That was the idea. So, and these wonderful light fixtures in the front, just incredible galactic imagery. And at the time this building was finished, this area of Orange County had nothing else around it. It was like a mirage. To see this off the 405 freeway with nothing else, it was like a dream. It was really, really fascinating. There's the landscape behind it, this very, reflecting off the building with this sunken cafeteria area. And it makes for these really interesting sort of anonymous, but weirdly aesthetic corporate landscapes. And there's what these towers are. That's a 93-foot tall tower. That keeps the air conditioning equipment. That's aluminum. And so that way, the rest of the roof lines are a smooth datum. There's no AC equipment on the rest of the roof at all. You have it all in there. The Bonaventure. So these are the more Baroque examples. The Bonaventure Hotel. So Fluor, Bonaventure, John Portman. This has been written of, I'll go back to it, completed in 1977. By rooms, this is still the largest hotel in LA by rooms. And this is the inside of it. Frederick Jameson, if you're familiar with him, has written quite a lot about the Bonaventure as one of the first instances of postmodern hyperspace, where when you go inside the space kind of it's not a passive space. You're manipulated, it's a fugue of circles within circles, it's easy to get lost. You sort of wander around this brutalist landscape, you shoot up these glass elevators that are on the outside with these views, and then you go to a rotating cocktail lounge where the floor is moving. So it's all about movement, it's all about manipulation. The Crystal Cathedral. So these are the Baroque examples, the big examples. Philip Johnson and John Berge. This was a church for a televangelist with 10,664 panes of glass. Those vented louvers are intended to be based off a 1970s van because you don't have an AC system inside it. Instead, you have this remarkable space, which to Philip Johnson is Gothic. It's skeletonization, it's verticality, and it's glass. But it's also, he saw it as kind of a tent and a stage set because the televangelist who commissioned this, Robert H. Schuller, was the first, he had a TV show, a Christian show called The Hour of Power, and it was the first show to be beamed in other countries, a Christian televangelist show. The organ player hits the keys, and there's two giant doors designed by NASA that open up, and you could stay in your car and listen to it on the radio. You don't even have to get out of your car. So it's very drive up. There's and Schuller's saying was, come as you are in the family car. And you could stay there. And there's an earlier building on this by Neutra. He was really good friends with Richard Neutra. Neutra had his funeral service in the earlier building before this was made. And this is, Schuller was really into Neutra's theory of biorealism, of connecting people with nature as something healthy. So Schuller wanted this to be all glass and all see-through from top to bottom. And it lets in 14% of the light. And so it's, reflective on the outside and then clear on the inside. And the televangelist who oversaw this got really into the design, and he compared it to people. He said, his quote was, "I believe that a healthy follower of Christ is emotionally open and transparent, and also a mirror in the sense that others can see God's goodness reflected in his or her life." But to kind of bring this full circle, to show the other Mies work, there's Friedrichstrasse again. Philip Johnson, who did this, worked, under Mies. So he's doing this as a sort of, later example of a mirrored glass. Schuller, by the way, was a Christian capitalist by his own admittance. So maybe it's no accident that Philip Johnson is referencing a style associated with corporatism. Philip Johnson tended to think things through. But I think this is a really sort of nice sort of expression of referencing Mies. Just a couple more Baroque examples. The later work tends to have some postmodern overtones. This is PPG Place, also by Philip Johnson from 1984. And of course, it's Victoria Tower also, a glass version of it. And, Pittsburgh Plate Glass, I'm surprised they didn't design a headquarters with their own glass, 20 years before. I don't know why they waited so long. It's a detail of it. And then this later work here, this is the tallest silicon glazing wall in the world at the time it was created. This is Fountain Place by I.M. Pei, 60 stories tall, 450,000 square feet. And one of those was made, not both. That was the model, that was the rendering, and there's the one being made. So they get bigger, more complex, more elaborate, just like architecture tends to do as it goes on. This mirrored glass skin finally sees its sort of grand finale in Hong Kong with works by Paul Rudolph. These are the most elaborate, very, very memorable designs in Asia. This is the Bonn Center or Lippo Center, completed, I think, in 1988. I don't have the year in front of me, but designed around 84 and completed in 88. And then Pei's Bank of China Tower from 1990. So by 1990, you're starting to lose the glass skin. You're starting to re-see structure coming through once again, but getting some really memorable works. And there's this version of the glass skin high-tech with Hong Kong Shanghai Bank in the background to just kind of show the two versions of high-tech kind of converging. Now, here's this structuralism coming through here. We're going to end with this. And there was no way I could get out of this lecture, right, Octave, without talking about this. This drawing is by a man named Charles Slurt. And Slurt was a protege of Tony Lumsden, his main student. And what this is this giant, of course, pyramid with, it looks like he did a cutout of Stirling's late 60s Simons project and just popped it in as a rendering. You could see sort of the same structural triangulation that we see in the Pei work. But this was designed for Giorgio Moroder, the synth lord and producer Giorgio Moroder. The story is this: Moroder saw this in 1992, done by Slurt, and this is in San Diego, outside of San Diego, California, called the Miramar Metroplex from 1992. And as soon as Giorgio Moroder saw this, he cold called Charles Slurt, and he says, "You need to meet me in Laguna Beach right now. We need to talk. I want you to design me a pyramid." And so Slurt said, "Oh, okay, let's meet." So Moroder wanted to build this pyramid called Moroder Sky, and lost interest in the project, and then got reconnected with everybody in the mid-2000s. And so by the mid-2000s, Slurt, who's on the right here, brought in a much older Tony Lumsden to help him. And so this is one of Tony Lumsden's last projects, and there's Giorgio Moroder right there. So Tony gets brought in. I don't know, I'm curious to know what Tony thought about it. Very different. And the idea of this, Moroder thought that the pyramid embodied the high-tech character that he was most interested in. The idea of this was you were going to have, it was to be a mega structure with living units included, like sort of constructed off site and then popped into the pyramid. And so this is about 2005, 2006. So Giorgio Moroder had connected with Slurt in the 90s and then comes back and they do this. So this pyramid was going to have 4.75 million square feet of development space, maglev elevators, luxury condos at the upper levels, a 5-star hotel, plug-in apartments, nightly laser light shows, and it was supposed to be 1 kilometer tall. So obviously, and Moroder shipped it around to different in the Middle East, asking if they were interested, and nobody was. But it was all very, very early in the conceptual process. But this is probably the most over-the-top reflective glass design one can conceive, that one knows of. But ultimately, it's about the vernacular. It's about the simple designs. It's about these designs that are kind of forgotten, that are perhaps lesser known. Like this one in Orange County. This is Mitsubishi Motor Sales of America by Del De Riveri and Associates, an architect that most people probably have never even heard of, from 1982. But it's wonderfully designed. It's overshadowed now by a new headquarters for Hyundai by Gensler. But yet it has these wonderfully considered qualities with its prismatics, this sort of future forward imagery, this reflectivity, this sculptural quality. And it is these where I think the heart of this design system lies, with these forgotten smaller scale works that are very vulnerable right now. A lot of this glass is not made anymore, so if too many pieces break, they decide to just reglaze the whole buildings. Just reglaze the whole thing because they don't want something that looks like gaps with glass that's slightly off. A lot of these buildings are for lease. There's nobody in them. They think these are passé or against the taste cycle. So all the more reason to try to understand them. And that was the original impetus, really, of trying, on my part, of trying to understand these. For not just for Orange County, but probably for an expanded area, they're very telling and very, very memorable and very evocative, very sort of anonymous indeed, but considered. And as taste cycles sort of evolve and people get interested, one hopes that the better expressions of these examples will not only be understood, but perhaps preserved. So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for still being here. I did not want to look at a clock.
We don't have much time. We don't have much time, but we can take a couple of questions.
Thank you. Hi. I just wondered, while this is your first trip to Europe, let alone England, yeah? I wondered if you've got any itinerary of building to see. Like I saw references to Willis Faber by Norman Foster in there, and obviously all of Canary Wharf and the buildings which aren't even in Canary Wharf anymore, the sort of remnants.
Well, I'm not going to be in London all that long. I would like to see you want the mic? So we
Maybe you can speak on the microphone over there.
That's right, I have a mic. Right. I thought you wanted me to walk around now. So I want to see the Richard Rogers building here. Is it Lloyd's? I really want to see that. I'm only going to be in London for 2 more days. I want to see One Poultry. I'm interested. One of your colleagues, Adam Furman, just wrote a wonderful book, and it really got me excited about Ferrell's work and some of the other works here. So I would love to see those, but honestly, I've been so busy getting for this trip and writing for this lecture, I haven't even thought about what I'm going to see in London yet. I don't know. So I'll try to think about it tomorrow, but I would definitely like to see those.
Yes, on the question of preservation, at the time that lots of the early buildings were being designed, because of course they're developing and these materials kind of new, was there an idea of how long they would last?
So was there an idea of how long they would last? That's a really good point. Not that I know of. I think that a lot of materials tend to give them a 50-year mark at the most. I do know that when mirror glass first came out, a lot of people were very excited about it. And and Cesar Pelli talked about these buildings as being very much in the now, very much of the present. He did not want to make timeless monuments. That doesn't mean he doesn't want to preserve his buildings. He's definitely trying to keep them now. But he talked about the fact that they reflect clouds or they always change as something very shifting. I do know that people were very excited. The mirror glass I don't think they were thinking too far into the future, because mirror glass was seen as futuristic in the present tense of 1971. But ironically enough, they weren't thinking about the future of the material. Early mirror glass had a lot of problems. Some of you may know about the John Hancock Tower in Boston. The Fleur building, which I showed you in Irvine, was also Libby Owens Ford glass, the same glass at the same time as John Hancock, and it all cracked on the east elevation because of the heat. So a lot of these very early buildings did have problems. So I think I seriously doubt they were thinking about the future in any way, shape, or form. And if they're working for big firms, they're probably just thinking about economy. Yes.
Can you talk about a bit of the tension at the time between the popularity and excitement of mirror glass buildings at the time, but also, I guess, a sentiment that made its presence felt in some of the, let's say, the 70s paranoia films about kind of sinister global kind of anonymity. So I just want to understand that there was, on the one hand, there's a great excitement, but also this other kind of sinister reception.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of these buildings have a real, Bhumi Daya Bank, I didn't, I just sort of skipped over it, but there's a certain paranoia even in that image. There's something a little, there's a tension, there's an anxiety in that. I think that people were really interested in sort of the sci-fi futuristic quality to this, and in a lot of futuristic aesthetics, the way that they're even presented when they're positive, there's a certain degree of, paranoia or fear that goes with it, but it's seen as kind of exciting. In 2001, there's a beauty to 2001, but there's also a tension with the future, a fear of the future, but it's gorgeous at the same time. So I think that corporations were really interested in it because it was relatively cost efficient. Tony's, those brown buildings I showed you on Wilshire, those three, he was doing those for $5 a square foot for the glazing. So, and the corporations saw it as, what Charles Jenks has called slick tech. They saw it, they were interested in the high-tech aspects to it. I think a little bit later, when it started to fall out of vogue, then at a certain point, mirror glass design system turned. People got tired of it, and maybe some of the later designs weren't so thoughtful, and people really shifted away from it, starting about a mix of the 1980 Venice Architecture Biennale and the AT&T building, and then Aldo Rossi's architecture in the city put into English, got a lot of other people interested in stuff based off San Cataldo with punch outs. But even the buildings done in that are skins. They're thin. They're thin. They're just using stone. But in its peak, it was exciting. It was futuristic, but there's a subtle paranoia to it as well. That's undeniable.
You had one last question? Did you?
I don't think so. I mean,
Okay.
just that was the most exhilarating.
Oh, you had one question.
Do you have time for one more?
Well, actually, best thing I've seen for a long, long time.
Thank you.
My question was about, I was kind of fascinated by your comparison of the minimal artists and influence on architecture. And I was thinking about artists like Dan Graham and suddenly wondering if people like Donald Judd and Dan Graham were influenced by the architecture itself. Like if you look at Chinati and Marfa and things like that. And what are your thoughts on kind of reading it backwards of how the architecture goes into those people's practices?
Well, there's this to, I think about. Super Studio and the two that I showed, Super Studio, Tony Smith, and then of course Archigram, all have architecture backgrounds right off the bat. So the minimalist, some of the minimalists at least, or not the minimalists, but some of the aesthetic concepts come from architecture. So already there's a thread of architecture running through it. In terms of Dan Graham, I don't really remember offhand when he starts his paintings. I think they're a little bit late, like there's works that are later. I believe, does he do mirror glass skin paintings? He does the mirror glass sculpture, that's right. Okay, I'm getting him confused with someone else perhaps. I don't know how much those later minimalist artists are influenced by the architecture. I would have to go back, put my art history cap back on, which I haven't done in a while. But I think it's a really good question, especially considering their later work. But I don't know. I don't know. I just know that Cesar and Tony were influenced by a variety of minimalist sculptors, including many that were trained in architecture backgrounds.
And I think it's a good question to finish because this link between the art scene of LA and this architecture is something that we discuss could be a good topic to expand in the book we're working on. Because as far as we know, there is not much that's specifically written on this specific moment. So yeah, thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.